As I'm sure many of you know, Donald Trump was not too happy when he learned that he had lost the 2020 election. He falsely claimed that there was massive election fraud and that if you just counted up all of the real votes, he won by a huge margin. Now, he and his team of advisors and crackpot lawyers, including a guy who married his cousin Rudy Giuliani and future psychiatric patient Sidney Powell, started to come up with a few theories on how they might be able to stay in the White House. One of those ways was potentially doing another new election and having Sidney Powell be the election czar, which I don't really know what that means or what that would have accomplished. They also argued that the Dominion voting machines were hacked, and this is one that Fox News ran with a lot, so much so that they got sued for defamation for hundreds of millions of dollars. Another crackpot theory was perhaps just having Mike Pence reject the Electoral College votes, despite him not being allowed to do that, and anyways, Mike Pence wasn't even on board with that plan, which is one reason why the January 6th insurrection happened, or if you ask a Republican congressman, it was just a January 6th tourist visit. However, in my opinion, the only plan that could have actually maybe given Trump a real chance at overturning the 2020 election was to try and get the Department of Justice on his side. You see, right after the election happened, Trump was pressuring his Attorney General, William Barr, to support his election fraud claims. Now, Bill Barr did not want to do this. He knew that there wasn't any real evidence to support election fraud. He even said that if there was any evidence of fraud, it was not nearly enough to overturn the election. Now, Trump kept pressuring him over and over again, and Bill Barr just kept saying no, until eventually in December, Trump was pissed. And Bill Barr just said, you know what, Mr. President, if you want me to resign, then I'll resign. On Monday, I am done. Now, Donald Trump was elated by this, because that meant that he could, without Senate confirmation, pick a new Attorney General. So, for acting Attorney General, he picks a guy named Jeffrey Rosen, and for acting Deputy Attorney General, he picks Richard Donahue. Now, these guys are professional DOJ employees. They know what they're doing. Now, Donald Trump, he goes to them and says, hey, can you guys support my election fraud claims? It would really help me out. And just like Bill Barr, Rosen and Donahue say, no, we can't. There is not credible evidence for election fraud. And Donald Trump goes to them and he's like, listen, I don't need you guys to find any actual evidence. I just need you guys to say that there was some election fraud. Leave the rest to me and the Republican congressman. I just need you guys to say that. And they still say, no, we can't do that. There was not actually any evidence. Now, Donald Trump is getting pretty pissed at this point. His Attorney General wouldn't help him, and the guys he replaced him with won't help him either. Now, at this point, looking at this, there's a mid-level environmental lawyer named Jeffrey Clark. He's looking at this, and he thinks to himself, I can score some pretty good points with the president, probably make a name for myself, and greatly advance my career. Now, just for some context, this guy was far down the totem pole at the DOJ. He was not anywhere near the top and should have really never been any consideration for being Attorney General or acting Attorney General or Deputy Attorney General at all. However, he goes to Trump and says, Mr. President, if you get rid of your current acting Attorney General and make me acting Attorney General, which you're allowed to do, I will support your election fraud claims and give credibility to your story. And Donald Trump he's like, finally, yes, I'll do it. And Jeffrey Clark's pretty happy because he's about to get a huge promotion. Now, it's at this point that I need to tell you that Jeffrey Clark is kind of a dumbass. Because what he does next is perhaps the stupidest move you could ever do. It's a pretty basic rule in like any kind of game, like chess or war or anything, that you don't tell your opponent your next move. Well, this is exactly what Jeffrey Clark does. He goes to Rosen and Donahue and says to them, the president is going to replace you guys with me because I'm going to support his election fraud claims. Now, this was pretty stupid because it gave time for Rosen and Donahue to come up with a plan. So, just before Donald Trump was going to make Clark the new acting Attorney General, a meeting is held. The president's there, along with Jeffrey Rosen, Richard Donahue, Jeffrey Clark, and a few other White House advisors. And basically, you have Rosen and Donahue talking to the president and saying, really? You're going to make this guy in charge. You're going to make this clown job of a guy in charge. And then they turn to Clark and say, you know what? Why don't you just go back to your office and we'll call you if there's an oil spill, all right? And then they basically give the president a choice. He's like, Mr. President, if you make this guy the acting attorney general, us and hundreds of other high-level DOJ employees are resigning within 48 to 72 hours. How do you think that would look? Now, I'm sure Donald Trump weighed his options. Sure, he could make Jeffrey Clark the head of the DOJ and then have that entire organization behind him and supporting his election fraud claims, giving legitimacy to it, and potentially giving him the chance to overturn the election. However, if while that's happening, your entire DOJ resigns, it doesn't look very good and kind of undermines anything the DOJ says and kind of removes any credibility from the DOJ. So eventually Trump caves and says, okay, I'm not making Jeffrey Clark acting attorney general. So Rosen and Donahue stay. A little while later, Jeffrey Clark gets indicted along with a bunch of other people for attempting to overturn the 2020 election. And Donald Trump, unfortunately for him, could not overturn the 2020 election. Now, in my opinion, this was the most credible plan for this. Having a legitimate cabinet organization behind you, even if it's just on paper and they're not really providing that much evidence, just having them say, I support the president's election fraud claims, would have gone a long way. Do I think this would have been enough to overturn the 2020 election in favor of Donald Trump? I doubt it. But I leave that as an exercise for you to figure out.